2 project from Heartland and Eastern Valley. I've participated in this and continue to, I guess. So I'd like to welcome Jake Monroe to the stage, who will be presenting on the second-year findings of the Maximizing Cereal Rye Cover Crop Management for Multiple Benefits.
The worst title ever. Yeah, we need to simplify that. Thanks, Warren. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, I've got this lapel mic, so I'll use it. Okay, so I think I'm starting a couple minutes early, so that's great. I'll just jump right into it. This is actually the first year of results. For those in Kingston last year, I kind of gave the overview of the project or the rationale behind it, but now we've got some numbers to show, so I'll jump right into it. Okay, so the project really has 2 parts. Part 1 is to evaluate the impact of planting soybeans green into a cereal rye cover crop and look at what that does in terms of crop development, weed impacts, and ultimately yield. So that's what I'm going to call the termination timing aspect of the project. The second part is to, again, use a rye cover crop, but manage it, I guess, more intensively and evaluate cover crop-based no-till and organic production systems and do a direct comparison with tillage-based 30-inch soybeans. So those are the two aspects. In terms of the termination timing component of the project, this year in the 2019 season, we had 4 on-farm and 2 research station sites, and they were equally split between the east and the southwest, and 3 treatments. So 1 treatment was a control, so there was just no rye seeded. The other treatment was rye that was seeded in the fall and then sprayed off early. So by early, typically, we're talking about 2 weeks before crop seeding. And then the third one was the plant green. So, seeding into that rye cover crop and then spraying it off very shortly after. They were all replicated and randomized field length strips. Or in the case of the the research station sites, they were, small plot or relatively small plot. For the organic, what I'm going to call the organic no-till component of the project, we had a combination of replicated strip trials. So we had 1 on-farm and 1 research station replicated strip trial. And then we had about 4 full or partial field observational sites. So these were sites where growers had already seeded the rye the following fall. And logistically, especially with the wet spring, it was going to be too challenging to have control strips. So we just had portions of fields where we evaluated the system and took measurements throughout the season. Okay, so in terms of the first component of the project, looking at termination timing, this is really what we're after. So looking at, can we kind of achieve a bigger benefit from that cereal rye cover crop by delaying termination? So this is the average of 9 site years. There's data in here from 2017 and 2018 as well. And this is what happens when we delay termination. For, on average, about 2 weeks, we get about 3 times more biomass. And this will really depend on, how the rye was seeded the following, or the previous fall, what kind of spring conditions you get. If you get a May like this year, you're not going to necessarily see that kind of increase. But on average, we're looking at about 3 times more biomass, and that's going to have, potential soil health benefits, organic matter benefits, and maybe some impacts on weeds. So speaking of weeds, here's just some visuals for you. So Mike Cobra was a part of the project and helped do some weed evaluations at a number of the sites. And this was our small plot site at Elora, where we had a moderate seeding rate of rye. And this just shows what the weeds, and this site had a pretty high density of weeds. So this just shows what the site looked like in the spring in the strip that had no rye. This is what the strip looked like that had, if I can flip, so that had early terminated rye, so again, just slightly fewer and smaller weeds. And then again, in the late terminated strip, again, we've got some weeds there, but they're much smaller. And so generally, that's what was observed from a weed perspective this year. I left the graph out just for the sake of time, but basically, at the critical weed-free period, around V1, V2 for soybeans, there was typically a decreasing density of weeds where we had rye present, and particularly where we terminated rye late. So not to say that it's the only solution, especially at moderate seeding rates, we're going to have minimal impact if we've got light rye. But as we get thicker rye, it can certainly be a tool to help keep weeds, a little bit shorter, a little bit more manageable with your herbicide program. Okay, so the other impact is looking at, what does planting green do to your soybean stand? So as I mentioned, this project kind of builds on some work that was done in Brant County with the Tier 1 project, where we had a few different sites in 2017 and 18. But basically, this is the story. As you plant into a thicker cover crop, you generally have a moderate reduction in soybean stand. And basically the two sites where we've seen issues are the sites where in 2018 we had a pretty, relatively low seeding rate, 140,000 seeds per acre planted, and in both of those cases, when we planted green into rye, we saw populations, well below 100,000. So that's certainly a situation we want to avoid, and at the end of the day, it's really about making sure that you're compensating a little bit, particularly if you're seeding into a relatively thick cover crop. The other aspect is that if you're seeding into a thicker rye cover crop, that will, and Peter alluded to this yesterday, that will certainly delay crop development. And so I'm not exactly sure what the threshold is yet, but certainly at a site like this is near Brantford in 2018, where we had about 2,000 pounds per acre dry. So about a couple tons per acre biomass. That certainly set the soybeans back a bit. So we saw shorter beans delayed by about one growth stage throughout the season. So, and that, I don't know how well you can make it out. You can see those strips in the background. This was the same site near Brantford. That carries through the season. So we see, delayed growth, shorter plants, and then also slightly delayed maturity at the end of the season. Again, in the situations where we have a thick mulch of rye. However, and now it's over 9 site years, we're not seeing any negative effect on yield. So in the Tier 2 project here, you can see that we've added that new treatment of no rye. So you can take a look at those numbers, but basically what the story is to date is that the yield impact of planting green compared to terminating early is neutral. So here are the numbers, the kind of average numbers overall. 54 bushels versus 53.4. So it's basically a wash, and you look at all those A's down the sides of the yield numbers, and that just says that there's no statistically significant difference at any of these sites. Okay, so to kind of wrap up this portion of the project, this was the first year of results from the project. We've got one more season as the Tier 2 wraps up, so we'll add to that. That set of data, those site years. But these are the best practices as far as I can see in terms of planting green into soybeans. So I'd say if you're brand new to it, start with early termination, or at least start with a plan to terminate early, would be my opinion, just to gain some comfort with rye as a cover crop in spring. But if you're at the stage of wanting to plant green, I definitely recommend a higher seeding rate, particularly if you're seeding into something thick. So 160,000 or above, and then paying attention to getting good slot closure. Again, that's more of an issue where we have thicker rye, but just making sure getting that slot closed, and then be flexible. So if we have spring like 2016 that's very, very dry, probably want to get out there early and spray that rye off instead of leaving it. Okay, so I'll switch gears to the second part of the project, which is again evaluating what we call cover crop-based organic no-till. So managing rye much more intensively to provide season-long weed control and weed suppression in an organic soybean system. Here's a couple of shots. This is a tool that's key to the whole thing, and this is where the Tier 2 project has been really helpful, because we've purchased a couple of those roller crimpers for the project that are being managed by Heartland Soil and Crop. And here's some of the motivation for the work. This is a field that I would have showed last year at the AGM. This was from 2018, and this was an organic grower near St. Mary's who's done this quite successfully for a number of years now, and is getting average or above average organic soybean yields using rye as his weed control. So here are the basics of the system or of the process for cover crop-based organic no-till. You want to get the rye seeded thick and early in the fall. So this fall, in preparation for next year, all of our sites, with the exception of a couple, were seeded in the month of September. So, targeting about mid-September and using a high seeding rate is really important. Helps protect the soil over the winter, of course, as we all know, and so that's a good thing in fields that are typically being tilled. And then we're, assuming we get the heat and the sunshine, we're looking at late May or early June for that rye to be ready to be crimped. So we're looking for about 50% flowering or 50% anthesis. Really does depend a little bit on the spring weather, because this year at some sites, a little bit more northern sites, we were waiting until mid-June. And so that's an issue, of course, in terms of seeding date. So something that we're maybe looking into in terms of variety in the future. But in general, the concept is you're hopefully in the first week of June, you're in there and you're crimping. Then you're planting into that mulch. And then you're basically doing nothing else for the rest of the season if all has gone well. So your mulch is providing weed control, and your soybeans grow up through it. So here's what happened across basically our 6 different sites. So 2 strip trials, 4 observational sites. Here's some of the things that we observed and some of the challenges that we had. Here's one of the sites. This was in Huron County. This just shows you some of the challenges of dealing with a thick cover crop and a thick mulch to plant through. What you can see here is that the rye was laying over to the side, and that drill did not do a good job of cutting through the mulch and getting the seed planted to depth. So that is definitely a concern and an issue, and there's ways to manage around that, but having well-maintained equipment is really, really crucial to making this system work. The conditions are just that much harder. Here's a couple of shots from our small plot site at Elora. So anyone at Farm Smart Expo in the summer would have seen these. And here we got a pretty good rye cover crop, a little bit lighter than we would have wanted. But our biggest challenge actually was we caused some maybe surface compaction. We had plant stand issues in all of our crimped strips. So I don't know how well you can make it out, but we've really got some damaged stands here in these 15-inch beans, and you can see later in the season that there's some gaps here in that stand. So that was one of the issues that we really didn't expect, but that we encountered, especially with this wet spring. Here's a couple of the other just observational sites. This one, you can start to see some ragweed coming through. It just illustrates that you need to have a thick cover crop, because it's doing a lot of heavy lifting in this system where you're not coming back in. And if this was in July, you can imagine what the ragweed was like later in August. So one of the more challenging sites. And then this site here, this is the more experienced grower. You can see some perennials coming through, but generally this was a very successful field on the bottom right. Hopefully this video will work. Let's see. Okay, so that's just a shot of, I guess, adaptive management, or when things don't exactly go as planned. So this was June 8th. This was at our on-farm site near Drayton, and this is basically what happens when you've got the drill lined up, the no-till drill lined up from the neighbor. He arrives, and then we realize that the rye is not ready to be crimped at all. It was not flowering yet. It was fully out in head and had been in head for several days at this point, and we'd expected it to start flowering, but that's what happens when you have very little warmth and very little sunshine throughout the month of May. So that's what the grower ended up deciding. Let's go in there and seed those soybeans into the standing rye, and then come back and crimp it a few days later. So I'll show you some photos now of what that looked like. So here are the soybeans. This is June 18th. Here are the soybeans. They're starting to come up. There was good moisture. There was good rainfall after that seeding. It looks like a bit of a mess. I think we were all a little bit wondering what was going to come of this plot. So this is what it looked like on June 18th. We had some German students come tour through this plot, and they were poking in there and looking at the soybeans, and it was kind of interesting. This is why we have yield compensation in these projects. So here's what the soybeans looked like on July 22nd. So here's the 30-inch beans. these growers were very happy with their regular 30-inch beans, particularly on this plot field. And then right beside it, here's the no-till, the organic no-till, the rye. They missed the window to crimp it in mid-June, so the beans were up, as you saw in that last photo. The beans were up here, just kind of hooking up through the soil. And by this point, it was, we're going to damage that stand too badly to go in there and crimp. So ended up waiting until about early July, and they went in and crimped. And then these soybeans are growing up through that crimped rye. So not an ideal scenario by any means, and not the textbook way to do this, but that's the way that it rolled out. And so that was July 22nd, and these are solid seeded soybeans, and they're looking pretty sparse. Here's, however, how it looked on August 20th. So, soybeans certainly delayed, about a growth stage behind and much shorter, but they've filled in more or less by August 20th. So they came along, but they were certainly playing catch up for the whole season. Just a couple of quick notes on soil moisture. These were from probes that we had at the small plot at Elora. This is an average of 4 temperature and moisture sensors collecting data every hour for this whole period throughout the growing season. You often hear about soil moisture. Does rye help reduce soil moisture, or does it keep it wetter? We actually found that in this system, the soil was wetter where there was rye throughout the whole spring period. That might be different if it was a dry spring, and that moisture would have been sucked up pretty rapidly. But basically, the difference started being reduced as we got more into June and eventually crimped on June 11th. So less of a difference here, but in general, we actually found that rye was keeping the soil a little bit wetter. So we'll see what happens next year. It did, however, as you might expect, conserve soil moisture in the summer. So when we had dry conditions throughout the end of June and into July, this moisture where we had that mulch of rye was much higher and helped conserve it really, probably at some point into early to mid-August. And just wrapping up here, here's what we saw for yields this year. So we had one site that really did not work out well. I have a 0 there. There were soybeans, but there were also a lot of weeds, and so it was not harvested by the grower. And again, this is why we have some yield compensation built in. So this was one of our learning experiences. I don't have time to get into why that didn't work out, but certainly getting a good stand established and cutting through that mulch is part of it. And then we had 2 observational sites where we had yields of 38 to 47 bushels. Organic soybeans, I think those were relatively successful. And at our Elora and Drayton sites, we had yield reductions somewhere in the range of 10 bushels, 9 to 10 bushels each. So from my perspective, a good learning year. This is why we do trials, and we want to see if we can tweak some things to make improvements for the future. So I know Warren's standing up, so I'm gonna wrap it up here in just a moment. Here's some of the communications that we've done for the project. We had a poster at the Outdoor Farm Show here. We got written up a couple times in the press and had a few different field days in the Heartland region anyway. And then just a few thank yous. Here's, I guess, thanks first to the cooperating farmers. There were quite a few of them. And then Sebastian, Mike, and Horst all helped with the project. Sarah Hargraves with EFAO has been a contributor and helped with some of the statistical analysis. Ian just did some stats for me last night, so thanks, Ian. And then there's been some advice given to us by some other researchers in the US. This Cribbit Seed and Thompson's both donated pretty significant amounts of seed to the project as well, so we certainly appreciated that. And I think we'll leave it there maybe for questions, Warren, and I can, if you have questions, you can maybe find me later. Does that work?
Yeah,
or if you have time.
A really quick question, and Ian's okay with that. All right, thanks a lot, Jake.
Okay.
Yeah.